I think there's a broad consensus today among modern economics that you can't just leave it to the market.
Joseph Stiglitz, former World Bank chief economist and Columbia University professor. He's been in Australia to promote his new book, The Road to Freedom. His message, that the free enterprise economy does not work and the system needs an overhaul. He wants to reclaim the word freedom from people like us, that is, classical liberals. So what to make of the Stiglitz thesis? We'll leave aside the unprecedented decline in world poverty since the turn of the century, a decline largely attributed to the spread of capitalism. Leave aside too that the sell-off in global stocks may represent a reckoning of the long period of excessive spending and easy money. In the Australian context, Professor Stiglitz gets us wrong. After all, we've benefited immeasurably from economic reform. With the currency and balance of payments crises of the mid-1980s, Australia, like much of the Western world, exploited an exciting spurt of capitalism. From the mid-1980s to the early 2000s, Australia, under both Labor and coalition governments, dismantled the import tariff war, liberalised the over-regulated labour market, privatised state entities, deregulated the financial markets and with regulatory oversight, lowered tax rates while broadening the tax base. Now, whatever you call this agenda, Professor Stiglitz, like most left-wing economists, calls it neoliberal. Those policies led to about 3 decades of growth with low inflation, low unemployment, balanced budgets, no net debt, and according to the Productivity Commission, no great widening in inequality. In real terms, national income per capita from the early 1990s to the late 2000s increased by 2/3. As a result, Australia was able to weather the global financial storm of 2008-09. However, since then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd blamed neoliberalism for the GFC, Labor and coalition governments have shied away from economic reform. Our politicians have settled into what the Australian Financial Review has called the complacency of prosperity. They've rested on the windfall of the China-fueled resources development boom. At the same time, our leaders have failed to curtail runaway government spending projects such as the NDIS, Gonski schools, public hospitals, childcare and aged care. The result? Productivity slowdown, wage stagnation, and $1 trillion national government debt. No wonder so many young people have grown up thinking that it's the duty of the state and not of themselves or their families to provide for them. Many, for instance, blame the housing affordability crisis on capitalism. Yet it's the failure of governments to allow enough house and apartment building to take place. Restricting development through state regulation and zoning, that just creates higher property prices. More supply will fix the housing crisis, but planning approval is stopping supply. So it's the government, not the market, that impedes younger Australians from buying into the housing market. Now, with the next financial panic, we can't just rely on China or the magic money tree to save us. Our political leaders and policymakers will instead need to exercise spending restraint to pay down the pandemic debt. They should embrace the kind of incentive-sharpening productivity reforms that made Australia a miracle economy. And yet Professor Stiglitz, he wants us to be more like a European social democracy, a Scandinavian welfare state. Never mind that Sweden has neither a formalised minimum wage nor an inheritance tax. And whereas Australia has one of the highest company tax rates in the OECD, it's about nearly 30%, Sweden taxes corporations at 20%. For Norway and Denmark, it's 22%. Higher levels of government intervention, as Professor Stiglitz urges, will only lead to sclerosis, the raising of taxes, the suppression of enterprise, and unsustainable debt. That just threatens our credit rating and borrowing capacity. And memo to US Republicans and Democrats alike. Higher levels of trade protectionism will just increase prices of imported goods and risk drawing us into the kind of slump that the world experienced in the 1930s. Now, Australians don't think in terms of big government or small government. We just want the state to act as a fair umpire that promotes individual freedom without creating an unacceptable level of insecurity. But there's also a long-run cost to dependency on the state, including an aversion to the kinds of risks that boosts entrepreneurial spirit necessary for innovation and prosperity. You see, people respond to incentives, and high taxes and regulations interfere with natural human creativity and drive. Australia won't profit from the opportunities the market economy offers by listening to the false prophets such as Joseph Stiglitz.